Yeah, so as Christine has mentioned, we will be talking about securing APIs for electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. So if you're going to be wondering about all of the references, you will be able to find them at the very last slide. So shortly, I would like to present you the agenda. So first, we're going to be speaking about how concerned should we be. So in this part, I will be briefly speaking about the electric vehicle market. Then we will be discussing why we're actually even talking about electric vehicles. Then we will be doing more of a deep dive into some of the more technical aspects and talking about some actual hacks that happened. Then we will be discussing the impact, solutions, as well as some regulatory and compliance considerations along the way. And of course, at any point, if you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat or address us directly. So let's begin. So actually, how concerned should we be? So since I honestly personally like reading a lot of statistical information, graphs, anything like that, so that's what I decided to do. So I found this table from a resource known as Our World in Data. I decided to emphasize this sentence where it is written that globally around 1 in 4 new cars sold were electric in 2023. And in Norway, this share was over 90%, and in China, it was almost as high as 40%. So if we take a look at the various graphs that we have here, so if you even take a look at all of them at the very same time, you can see that from 2010 to 2014 to 2016, the rate was kind of slow. Then starting from 2020 to 2023, the rate went high, very high, and especially in Norway and some other countries. And this kind of reminds me of when I visited my colleagues in Michigan at the beginning of this year, and I was just spending a few weeks there. And then I asked my colleagues, like, where are all your electric cars? Because in Michigan, I would mostly see diesel, petrol-based cars, but no electric vehicles, except for just a few, I think. So then my colleagues said, well, for example, if you move to, for example, California, you would see like almost 80% of the cars would be electric vehicles. So here is kind of like a similar example, like with states in the US, similarly to countries. So basically, some countries adapted to EVs a lot sooner, such as Norway, and others proceeded to do that a bit later. But generally speaking, the electric vehicle market is growing. And since I like statistical information, I have a bit more of that. So I found some very interesting facts from a source known as the International Energy Agency. So I'm going to read just a few of them to grasp the majority, to grasp basically the vastness of the EV market. So basically, almost 14 million new electric cars were registered globally in 2023, bringing their total number on the roads to as high as 40 million. Also, electric car sales in 2023 were 3.5 million higher than in 2022, which is a 35 year-on-year increase. And then electric cars accounted for around 18% of all of the cars sold last year, up from 14% in just 2022 and only 2% 5 years earlier in 2018. And lastly, battery electric cars accounted for as high as 70% of all of the electric car stock last year. So it's pretty safe to say that the numbers are huge. So once again, why are we actually speaking about AVs, as we have already established it's a growing market, but why are we actually talking about them? So as you all know, if you have a regular car that's running on petrol or diesel, you can just hop into your car, drive to the nearest gas station, pay in cash, and just drive away onto the road. But if you have an EV, so first of all, most electric vehicles are modern connected cars, right? So that means that if you have an EV, it's probably got a lot of electronics, of course, a lot of features. And usually cars like that come together with applications. Of course, not necessarily EVs only, but usually such cars come together with mobile applications. And of course, we have to use a charging station. So for that, you might also need to, let's say, register online on a website or register on a mobile application. You will need to supply some personal information. You will need to perform payments, and all of that information, all of those things that you do are connected or basically intertwined in between APIs, which is something that we aim to secure and which is also a potential target for malicious threat actors, which we will be discussing in more detail later. So one of the, I wouldn't say necessarily first hacks that I read about, but I remember reading about this one quite a long time ago. And when I read about this specific Nissan Leaf hack, it kind of reminded me about the infamous Jeep hack, because in this case, there were also two security researchers named Troy Hunt and Scott Helme. I hope I didn't butcher those names, but basically what they did, they discovered that Nissan's Leaf car application can potentially be used to remotely hack any Nissan Leaf's in-car systems. And all of that could be done simply by the use of API. And all they needed to do for that hack is to know the vehicle identification number, to control car features remotely without using, for example, any passwords. And they also found that the features such as the car's current battery life, including travel times and distances and climate control, can be hacked into as well. And what is more, attackers would not even need to use the application since the commands could be sent via a web browser. Even though this might not seem like the most tragic scenario, because if we take a look at the Jeep hack, they were able to control the steering wheel, for example, right? But in this case, the researchers found that, for example, they could enable heated car seats, for example. So if the owner went home, went to sleep, and hackers remotely could enable the heated car seats functionality, for example, that means that during the duration of the night period, the car would be drained completely. So let's say the owner woke up, he had to go to work or even to hospital, and he wouldn't even be able to do that. So that's just one example. And also on the topic of using applications, VIN numbers, and so on, I would like to also talk again just generally about electric vehicles and mobile applications. So of course, if you have a pretty modern car, you might also have an application that you can install and connect to your vehicle to unlock and also enable all kinds of various features, right? But if you have an electric vehicle, another feature that will be visible on your screen is, of course, charging. But what if you have an electric vehicle and you're interested in having a lot more, let's say, in-depth information about where are all the charging stations, what are the prices, and like just everything in detail? Well, there are a lot of applications to choose from, so I decided to take just basically any random of those applications as an example. So I found this so-called exclusive features of EV charging station finder app. And here we have listed all of the various features that it offers. So one of them is like having to sign up and create a profile. The other one is booking a charging slot, locating the nearest charging stations, real-time map navigation, tracking your charging sessions, even earning points and discounts, also payment features and tracking, also compatible with numerous charging networks, and custom UI UX. So that is a lot that you can do with it. But also it comes at a great risk because, once again, you need to supply your information. You can perform payments. Also, something such as real-time map navigation is mentioned, and let's say if the application is supplied not by the OEM itself, but by a different company, and the company would suffer, let's say, some kind of breach or other type of attack, then potentially your information that you have installed on that application may also become a target and may also lead to having your private data exposed. So since I also like reading a lot and I did quite a bit of research for this presentation, I stumbled upon a white paper. So this white paper is called Cybersecurity of Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure, Open Issues and Recommendations. Then, while reading through this white paper, I saw that there was a table which was called Common Cybersecurity Threats and Attacks Against EV Chargers. And I saw that one of the first security threats listed on this table was APIs, and more specifically, having no API authorization. And then they continued to explain that this attack scenario, for this attack scenario, it was said unsanctioned remote control of the charger and so on. So, in terms of reading about having lack of API authorization, EVs, and charging stations, I'm gonna pass the microphone to my colleague, and he's gonna dig a bit more deeper into this topic.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you for that, Agni. So moving on, these are some of the real life examples of smart car chargers being hacked. So there was this firm out of the UK called Pentest Partners where they took a bunch of EV chargers and decided to test it. Some of them were Project EV, Wallbox, EV Box, EO Hub, and its Mini Pro 2, the Rolec and Hypervolt. And like Agni had mentioned in the white paper, some of the issues that were found on these some were like allowing hijacking of millions of smart EV chargers. You can see they had major API authorization issues, which allowed anyone to take over anyone else's account, as well as complete remote control of all chargers. Another issue was no authorization at all. Um, Most often, even when it comes to APIs, many of them usually have the device ID in its endpoint, and followed by that, the commands to execute on it. So, in this case, all of that is very predictable, and you can often find that out easily, which was a big issue. I know it's not relevant to API security, but just worth mentioning, in the white paper, it did say that there was no firmware signing and things like that, which sometimes can be triggered through APIs as well. So sometimes you could push OTA updates through certain API calls. And lastly, like in this example here, it said that one public charging station exposed an unauthenticated GraphQL endpoint, which is used to build up an API, which exposed a bunch of user data and charger data as well. And we'll dive in more to the things that actually build up an API. Next, please. So here's an attack surface within an API. This is just an example, but just to give you guys an idea, it in this case, like the Kong API gateway is connected to the front end. You have a nice GUI, and it's using the REST API with a bunch of things. And most importantly, in this particular example, um, it's using an IoT agent as MQTT, which is a lightweight protocol, usually used on most IoT devices. And you can find it on anywhere from cars, vehicles, basically everything. And that often um, can be interfaced with OCPP, which is the Open Charge Point Protocol for most EV chargers. So you have OCPP 1.6J and even the later 2.0, which actually helps you, which is the main way of the charging station actually communicating with everything. So you go from your physical charging station, which you would interact with along with the front end, which can be an application and things like that, like ChargePoint or Tata Power, which then communicates with the API, and then you have this nice flowchart. Next, please. So the reason why I wanted to highlight on the attack surface within API alone is in the case of MQTT, quite often a pattern that's been seen worldwide is MQTT is, while the API level on the front might be secure, the technologies underlying that are left wide open sometimes. This is an exploit from last year, I believe, where I had found an MQTT broker exposed on the internet just through Shodan, and you could connect to it and then um, issue commands and things like that directly to several several hundred electric vehicles actually. So while um, while the electric vehicles, in this case scooters, were actually using an app which gave customers access to an API and a bunch of other things which they could control, an attacker could also go from the other way and get straight into the MQTT broker and then do the same things that they would if they had access to the API. Next, please. So this is what the broker actually looked like once you connected to it. So you had different information on it, such as the version of MQTT, the payload, and diagnostics, because they were using this for their telematic system as well, mainly. And so each of the topics over here, such as BGOS, Omega, Lokia, Kinetic, were all actually brands of electric scooters in India. So a lot of this had data like your timestamps, the type of vehicle, the firmware it was running, and as well as the CAN data, which could be manipulated remotely. Next, please. So after finding each topic, um, if you would go to some of these websites, many of the scooters actually gave the end user the ability to remote start, find your scooter, remote lock and unlock, boost speed, anti-theft, motor locking, as well as an anti-theft alarm. The problem with this is that in case anyone was to take over someone's account, you can do things like this, which was first intended for the customer themselves. But now that we have access to the backend, we can issue all these commands remotely as an attacker. Next, please. So diving into the actual MQTT payload example, um, so this might not actually be visible on an API level. All of this is probably broken down and displayed in a very nice format, and probably the CAN data never even reaches the API level. But in this case, data that you could see on an app which is passed through the APIs are your longitude, latitude, and if everyone's familiar with CAN, it's eight 8 bytes of data. In this case, zeros or A9, and so forth, which is essentially the CAN bus is the internal network of any vehicle itself. It's how each component on the vehicle speaks to each other, and the ability to inject CAN frames results in an ability to alter the vehicle state. So you could start it, stop it, um, hit the brakes if the brakes were connected via CAN, and a bunch of other things. So you also had your unique ID for the device, which was later used to go in and look at the API, which was useful. As well as over a period of time, you could actually filter just by the unique ID for each device and track exactly where a user has been just by logging the longitudes and latitudes in the next slide. So this is a map of every single scooter that was logged connected to this um, fleet management system or the back end of this app. So there's a nice QR code right there that'll take you to a website where you can actually go in and see the vehicles moving over a period of time. I think it was maybe an hour or so, but yep. Next, please. Moving on, while that was more of a privacy and maybe physical security issue, another company that uh, sorry another company that did some more research was SciFlow, an Israeli company that had done multiple papers on EVs and EV chargers mainly. So they had actually gone out of the Charger Sync platform where they were able to bypass the pin codes just by using an old exposed endpoint that let anyone bypass the pin code requirement during the provisioning purposes. Um, it very often things like this are left during the development phase and just remain undocumented, uh, just waiting for an attacker to come find and then exploit. You also had several other things like the file import vulnerability where you could um, upload import sensitive information such as your ID tags, emails, usernames, which were easily enumerable, which led to a lot of data exposure. And my personal favorite, OCPP hijacking, where the lack of basic authentication methods allowed anyone to hijack the OCPP connection, which would prevent you from actually charging your own vehicle, as well as exposing a bunch of data. Next, please. I'll hand it over to Agni to take over.
Yes, thank you. We'll take a look from here. So now we have to talk a bit about the impact. So speaking from a general sense, so we have one example is service outage. So let's say there is a denial of service or a distributed denial of service attack, which causes service outage. Then we have, for example, interrupted charging. Then we have a data breach or privacy implications. And finally, we have something like control vehicles features like we had with the Nissan Leaf hack example. So what I like to do sometimes at work and sometimes in life. So it's to look at the SFOP scenario. So SFOP is something that's taken from TAR. So S stands for safety, F for financial, O for operational, and P for privacy. Damage plus I like to include reputation. So if we take a look at the safety damage and we take controlling vehicles features as an example, so sometimes, let's say if there is let's say in some countries I read that there are such things as electric ambulances, and let's say if an electric ambulance isn't able to charge or charging is interrupted, as an example, and it gets notification to drive to a specific location right away, and it is not able to do that, then potentially it could be considered as damage to safety, or let's say if some kind of vehicle's feature is taken over and it is controlled remotely, then of course there can also be damage to safety. If we take a look at the financial aspects, so potentially all of these could lead to financial damage. If we take a look at operational, so operational, as an example, would be controlling vehicles features or not being able to perform some kind of action such as charging. If we look at privacy, then we take a look at suffering a data breach or suffering privacy implications. And of course, I like to include reputation, as I mentioned. So any of these could also have eventually an impact on reputation. So now we have solutions. So the first one that I included is a proactive security approach. So such an example could be, let's say, for performing penetration testing, performing vulnerability analysis, or doing threat intelligence, any of those. So having a proactive security approach is always a good idea, or you could do even a combination of all of these that I suggested. Another one is intrusion detection and prevention systems. So uh, the idea is to be able to early on identify and act on those intrusions that you detect. Then we have strong authentication and authorization. Then we have developing and maintaining an incident response plan. So One thing is having an incident response plan, and the other thing is continuing to develop and improve the incident response plan and have it readily available to you in case something bad happens. Then we have transformation towards zero trust. So transformation towards zero trust, it means basically that in a sense, the organization shouldn't trust anyone and should automatically not trust that's anything outside of their parameters. In other words, instead, it must verify anything and everything, trying to connect to their systems before granting any kind of access. Other slide here we have is regulatory and compliance considerations. So this in itself is almost like a separate, very broad topic. So what I wanted to highlight here is the first thing, having industry standards. So overview of relevant standards and regulations, for example, ISO 27001 or NIST, and another is compliance requirements. So specific compliance requirements for EV manufacturers and service providers. So what I'm getting at here is, well, actually included here a quote from the 2024 Automotive Cybersecurity Report. So basically here it says that OEMs and EV charge point operators, known as CPOs, continue to deepen cybersecurity risk assessments, expanding processes to also cover IoT protocols, standards, and regulations. It is also crucial to evaluate and adopt purpose-built solutions to protect strategic EV charging infrastructure. And also new regulations for electric vehicle supply equipments, known as EVSE, have emerged in the United States and UK. China is also conducting and enacting regulations for EVSE, AVs, and automotive information security. So finally, what I'm getting at here is that personally, I would like to see in the future more industry standards, regulations, anything of that sort coming out together with more explanations, guidance, anything such as related to also APIs and electric vehicles altogether. Because if you remember, I showed you a white paper talking about electric vehicles, cybersecurity, and I showed you a table where API threats was in the very first row. So hopefully in the future, whenever we potentially are going to see more industry standards, regulations related to EVs come out, we will also see specific fields focusing on APIs because as we have already discussed during this presentation, APIs and EVs basically go hand in hand because of how many different types of applications we have together intertwined all in between. So lastly, these are some of the references that we used. And if you have any questions, now is the perfect time. Or of course, feel free to reach out to us via